Let me tell you something that almost sounds too strange to be real. The President of the United States launched military strikes on a sovereign nation, strikes that could spiral into one of the most dangerous confrontations in the Middle East in decades. And then, that same night, turned to a television drama from the early 2000s to explain why he did it. Not a press briefing, not a carefully worded statement from the Pentagon, a clip from a fictional TV show. Think about that for a moment, because if that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what will. Here's the setup. Earlier that Tuesday, American forces launched a new wave of strikes against Iranian targets. This came after Iranian forces shot down a U.S. Army helicopter operating near the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically critical waterways on the planet. The White House called the strikes necessary. Military officials, very deliberately choosing their words, described the action as a proportional response. That phrase, proportional response, is important. We'll come back to it, because that night, President Trump logged onto his social media platform and posted a clip from The West Wing, that beloved NBC drama about a fictional American presidency, in which the characters specifically debate whether or not a proportional response is the right answer. And in the clip, the fictional president dismisses the very idea of proportionality. He mocks it. He rejects it. Now, does that mean Trump was secretly signaling that what the Pentagon called proportional wasn't proportional at all? Or was he just posting a clip he found satisfying? Was this strategic communication dressed up as nostalgia? Or was it something stranger? Guys, this is where modern geopolitics gets genuinely surreal, and also deeply important to understand, because beneath all of this noise is a confrontation that has been decades in the making, and which now appears to be moving into territory that nobody can fully predict. Let's start with the basics, because context matters more than headlines. The Strait of Hormuz, where that American helicopter went down, is not just a stretch of water. It is arguably the single most important maritime choke point on Earth. Around 20% of global oil supply passes through it. If that strait is disrupted, even temporarily, energy markets shake, shipping costs spike, and the economic tremors move outward to every continent. Iran knows this. The United States knows this. And every government with any stake in global commerce knows this. When any military incident happens at or near the Strait of Hormuz, the stakes are not limited to the two countries directly involved. They extend outward in every direction, because the world's energy security flows through that narrow strip of water. Now think about what it means that an Iranian military unit shot down an American Army helicopter near that strait. This isn't a roadside skirmish in a faraway desert. This is a kinetic military act in one of the most watched and most sensitive maritime regions on the planet, against the armed forces of the most powerful military nation in the world. That is not an accident. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a deliberate escalation, and it demands a response. The question that has dominated American military strategy for the last several decades is what kind of response? Here's where the West Wing clip starts to get really interesting, and I mean that, because that show, written in a very different political era, produced in a world before social media, before drone warfare became routine, before the full contours of the modern Middle East had taken shape, was wrestling with a question that governments have wrestled with for centuries. How do you respond to force without either backing down or starting a war you don't want? The fictional president in that episode rejects the proportional response framing. His argument essentially is that proportionality is a trap, that it signals restraint to your adversary, and in doing so invites further provocation. Some military strategists actually share that view. The theory is that disproportionate responses create deterrence, that they impose costs so severe that the other side concludes future attacks aren't worth the price. You hit back harder than you were hit, the thinking goes, and you don't get hit again. But here's where it gets interesting in the real world. When Trump's own military officials stepped in front of cameras and specifically used the phrase proportional response, they were doing something intentional. The U.S. military does not choose its language carelessly. When a spokesman says proportional, they are communicating not just to the American public, but to every government monitoring the situation. Iranian military commanders, allied defense ministries, shipping insurers, oil traders. The word proportional in military diplomatic language is a signal. It means we responded. We responded to the specific incident. We are not escalating beyond that incident, and we are leaving a door open. It is calibrated language meant to prevent the situation from spiraling. Now Trump goes on his social media platform and posts a clip of a fictional president laughing at the concept of proportionality. So which is it? Is the United States pursuing a proportional, limited response? Or is it signaling something more expansive? That ambiguity, intentional or not, is itself geopolitically significant. Look, some analysts would argue that this ambiguity is actually a strategy. The idea being that you keep your adversary uncertain. You make them calculate against a wide range of possible responses, and that uncertainty in itself is a form of deterrence. If Iran believes the U.S. might respond proportionally, they can calculate the acceptable cost of the next provocation. But if they believe the U.S. might respond in ways that are impossible to predict, if the decision-making in Washington appears to operate outside normal frameworks, then the calculus becomes much harder. This is not a new idea. It has roots in what strategists call the madman theory, the notion that an unpredictable leader creates deterrence simply through unpredictability. Richard Nixon reportedly used a version of this during the Vietnam era. Whether Trump is consciously deploying such a strategy or simply doing what he has always done, communicating instinctively through media and cultural references rather than formal channels, is something that, honestly, even close observers of his presidency disagree about. But here's a layer that I think gets overlooked in most of the coverage. When we talk about the U.S.-Iran confrontation as if it's a simple bilateral dispute, we are missing most of the picture. Iran does not operate in isolation, and neither does the United States. This incident, a helicopter downed, strikes launched, a late-night social media post, is one node in an enormously complex regional architecture. On one side, you have Iran and its network of allied militia groups, proxy forces, and state relationships stretching from Lebanon through Syria and Iraq and down into Yemen. On the other side, you have the United States and its Gulf partners, Israel, and increasingly the broader coalition of nations whose economic stability depends on the freedom of navigation through those waters. Think about international shipping for a moment. When military officials mentioned strikes in response to attacks on commercial ships transiting regional waters, they were invoking something much larger than one helicopter. There have been recurring incidents over recent years in which commercial vessels in and around the Gulf have been harassed, seized, or damaged in ways that intelligence agencies have attributed to Iranian actions or Iranian-aligned forces. For the shipping industry, for the companies moving oil, for the firms carrying cargo, this is an insurance and operations nightmare. When the region heats up, Lloyd's of London war risk premiums rise. Shipping companies reroute. Cargo takes longer to arrive. Supply chains, already fragile after years of global disruption, absorb another shock. The costs don't stay in the Gulf, they move. Now, layer on top of that the energy market dimension. Iran is itself a major oil producer, operating under significant international sanctions, but still finding ways to move product, particularly through intermediaries and gray market buyers who prefer not to advertise the arrangement. When the United States conducts military operations against Iranian facilities or forces, there is always the question of whether Iran will respond by attempting to restrict maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. They have threatened to do exactly this on multiple occasions. They have practiced the capability. They have not yet carried it out in a sustained way, partly because doing so would harm not just the United States, but virtually every major economy, including countries in Asia that buy significant amounts of Gulf energy. But the threat is real. And the closer the confrontation gets to open conflict, the more seriously markets have to price in that possibility. Here's something to understand about how governments manage these crises. Not just the United States, but all governments in the region. There is almost always a gap between the public narrative and the private conversation. Publicly, the U.S. says proportional response. Publicly, Iran's government makes statements about defending its sovereignty. But quietly, through diplomatic back channels, through intermediaries in Oman or Qatar or elsewhere, messages are being exchanged. Red lines are being communicated. Both sides, in most of these episodes, are trying to manage escalation while maintaining their domestic political narratives. Iran's government cannot appear to yield to American pressure without paying a political price at home. The American government cannot appear weak in an election-sensitive political environment without paying a price too. So both sides perform for their audiences while trying not to actually stumble into a conflict that neither side truly wants. Because a real, sustained military conflict between the United States and Iran would be catastrophic for both and for the region. But, and this is important, the management of escalation depends on clear signals. It depends on each side being able to read the other's intentions accurately. It depends on a kind of shared understanding of what actions mean and what responses they will trigger. And this is precisely where the West Wing Post becomes something more than a quirky cultural moment. When a president uses a television drama to communicate foreign policy signals, even obliquely, even informally, the other side has to interpret it. Iranian analysts are not just reading Pentagon briefings. They are reading social media posts. They are watching what messages a president chooses to amplify. And a post that seems to mock the idea of proportionality on the same night that military strikes are being described as proportional creates interpretive noise. It muddies the signal. And in crisis management, muddied signals are dangerous. Now think about this from a broader historical perspective. The United States and Iran have been locked in a cycle of escalation and de-escalation since 1979. In those 4.5 decades, there have been moments of extraordinary tension. The hostage crisis, the tanker war of the 1980s, the shoot-down of Iran Air Flight 655, the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And through all of it, both sides have managed, through a combination of deterrence, back-channel diplomacy, and calculated restraint, to avoid direct, sustained warfare. That is genuinely remarkable when you consider the depth of the hostility and the frequency of the provocations. But that track record of managed confrontation is not a guarantee. Every episode that escalates raises the floor for what each side considers manageable, and raises the probability that the next incident tips from management to crisis. What makes the current period particularly worth paying attention to is the convergence of multiple pressures. You have an Iranian government facing genuine economic strain from years of sanctions, navigating domestic political tensions, and making what appear to be increasingly assertive choices about how to project power and test American responses. You have a U.S. administration that has repeatedly signaled a desire to project strength and avoid being seen as retreating from confrontation. You have regional actors, in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf, who have their own calculations and their own interest in how this confrontation evolves. And you have a backdrop of great power competition, where China and Russia both have strategic interests in how the Middle East unfolds, and where a destabilized Gulf is not necessarily contrary to the interests of states that would prefer a distracted or overextended United States. One possible explanation for the West Wing post that I don't think gets enough serious consideration is this. It was a message to a domestic audience more than a foreign one. Trump has always been a communicator who operates through cultural touchstones, through references that resonate with his base, through media that feels familiar rather than formal. The West Wing, for a certain generation of Americans, is a cultural artifact loaded with meaning, either positively, as a vision of principled leadership, or negatively, as a symbol of the kind of beltway liberalism that his supporters have spent years pushing back against. Using a West Wing clip to justify a military strike is a way of saying, I'm not doing the weak, measured diplomatic thing. I'm doing the strong thing. I'm the president who acts. Whether that message was directed at voters, at critics, at allies, or at adversaries, or all of the above simultaneously, is genuinely hard to disentangle. And perhaps it was not designed to be disentangled. Here's where I want to bring this back to the strategic level and ask the question that matters for the next several months. Where does this go? Guys, there are a few possible trajectories here, and none of them are simple. The first scenario is what I'd call managed escalation, a pattern in which both sides periodically trade blows, each maintaining deniability or justification, while back-channel communication keeps the escalation ladder from being fully climbed. This is essentially the pattern of the last several years, and it is held, more or less, through multiple administrations. The risk is that each cycle desensitizes both sides to the next level of escalation, and that eventually something, a miscalculation, a miscommunication, a loss of life at an unexpected scale, breaks the pattern. The second scenario involves a negotiated framework, some form of agreement that constrains Iranian nuclear ambitions and reduces the frequency of proxy attacks in exchange for sanctions relief or other concessions. This was, broadly, what the original Iran nuclear deal attempted. Whether the political will exists on either side to pursue such a framework in the current climate is deeply uncertain. But it remains theoretically possible. And some analysts suggest that the escalation we are seeing is, in part, a form of coercive pressure intended to bring Iran back to the table on more favorable terms. The third scenario, the one that everyone hopes to avoid but nobody can rule out, is a sustained military confrontation that neither side fully controls once it begins. This is the scenario that keeps defense analysts up at night. Because once conventional military operations between the United States and Iran reach a certain threshold, the secondary effects become very hard to manage. Proxy forces on multiple sides begin operating. The Strait of Hormuz becomes a theater. Regional governments are forced to choose sides. Energy markets convulse. and the diplomatic architecture that has, however imperfectly, kept this confrontation from going all the way for over 40 years comes under severe strain. None of this is inevitable. That needs to be said clearly. The history of this specific confrontation is also a history of leaders on both sides choosing, at critical moments, not to go further. And that capacity for restraint has not disappeared. But restraint requires clear thinking, clear communication, and a shared, even if adversarial, understanding of where the lines are. And when a president chooses to communicate through a TV drama clip on a social media platform, one of the things that gets complicated is that shared understanding of where the lines are. There's one more dimension I want to touch on before we wrap up this analysis, because I think it gets at something fundamental about how power works in the modern world. There was a time when the conduct of foreign policy was primarily a matter of official channels: State Department cables, UN addresses, diplomatic notes, back-channel phone calls between leaders. The public knew what they were told when they were told it through carefully managed communication systems. That world is gone. Today, a presidential post on a social media platform at 11 o'clock at night is geopolitically live immediately. Read in Tehran, analyzed in Beijing, parsed in Brussels, disseminated to markets in Singapore and London and New York before the night is over. This is not inherently bad. Transparency in foreign policy has real value. Publics deserve to understand the choices their governments are making. But it creates a kind of permanent noise around decision-making that historically happened in quieter, more controlled spaces. And when the signals being sent through those informal channels are ambiguous, when a TV clip seems to contradict a Pentagon briefing, when the tone of a social media post diverges from the official language of a military statement, the interpretive burden on every party watching increases significantly. Every adversary, every ally, every market participant has to decide which signal is the real one. Some analysts suggest, and it's worth considering seriously, that this ambiguity is itself a form of power. That keeping adversaries guessing about your actual intentions and your actual thresholds forces them into a more conservative posture because they can't risk acting on a misread. There is genuine strategic theory behind that view, but there is also a counter-argument, which is that ambiguity only works as a deterrent if the other side believes you are capable of actually following through on the worst-case interpretation of your signals, and that calculating that wrong in either direction can have consequences that spiral beyond anyone's control. The strike near the Strait of Hormuz, the downed helicopter, the official language of proportionality, the West Wing clip. These are not disconnected random events. They are moments in a long confrontation, and they are happening against a backdrop of extraordinary complexity. Nuclear negotiations, proxy warfare, energy economics, great power competition, domestic politics on multiple sides. If you're watching this and you're trying to make sense of it, here's the frame I'd offer. What you're seeing is not a sudden crisis. It's an ongoing confrontation that occasionally breaks through to the surface of public attention, looks chaotic in the moment, and then recedes again until the next surface event. But beneath the surface, the pressure is continuous. The competition is continuous. And the question of where it ultimately leads is one that nobody, not in Washington, not in Tehran, not in Beijing, not in any of the capitals trying to navigate this, can answer with certainty right now. What we can say is that the choices made in these moments matter. The signals sent matter. The language chosen matters. And yes, even the late-night social media posts matter. Because in a world where every signal is immediately global, the line between informal commentary and official policy communication has effectively ceased to exist. That's the world we're in. And that's why a clip from a television show about a fictional president posted in the small hours after real military strikes on a real country is not just an odd cultural footnote. It's a window into how power is exercised, communicated, and sometimes deliberately obscured in the 21st century. Whether that's reassuring or alarming probably depends on which side of the conversation you're on.